Greetings and welcome to In Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. We are dedicating this conversation to looking at the THA and its interaction with the PDP leadership. To do so, we are joined by financial analyst Mr. David Walker. Greetings, Mr. Walker. How are you doing?
I am doing very, very well. Enjoying the sunshine today.
Yes, I hear it. But I want to ask though, because I'm from country and the area that I'm from, many people are related. And sometimes when someone is telling you something about someone else, you should nod. You shouldn't even smile, because a little later down, when those individuals make up, you may hear that you were the person who said those gave those egregious statements. So I want, in terms of starting this conversation, I know I'm definitely on the outside looking in, so I'm going to try to be as curious and objective as possible. But I want to ask, what is your reference point? Do you have a dog in this fight? Where are you coming from with regard to this situation?
I'm delighted that you asked me that, because I was going to raise it anyway, because I do have an interest in this matter, and in the interest of openness and transparency, I do need to have that recognized. After much deliberation, I have agreed to accept the position as a director of one of the state-owned companies in Tobago. You know, there's a story behind that as well. You know, having been a commentator and a critic all these years, when presented with the opportunity to make a difference, it became almost impossible to say no, because if you sit on the sidelines, you know, saying you should do this, you should do that, you should do the other. But a lot of my friends, unfortunately, when presented with the opportunity, walk away, and I made the decision not to do that.
And I'm grateful that you're able to say that, and because that also kind of segues into the conversation, speaking about transparency, looking at openness, and having a demand, a call for openness in a situation such as this, where one person says, okay, well, this is the issue, and someone says, okay, well, this, let's qualify what it is you're saying. So the two may not be mutually exclusive, but at the same time, this is the context in which this is a truth. So that call for openness, that call for transparency, and just having people know where their money is being spent in these times where we're always trying to, I guess, band our belly a little more. Where do you sit in terms of the call for openness and the need for such?
Well, I am a big advocate for openness in all of government expenditure, all of government business, for that matter. And with respect to this particular issue, the matter revolves, to my mind, initially around the necessity, as it was displayed, to assist some of the Tobagonians who had found themselves in an unfortunate situation in New York. We have now come to understand that over $400,000 was spent or committed. I'm not sure which it is. Whichever it is, it means that $400,000 of taxpayer dollars have gone towards this particular item of expenditure. And I am wanting to hear that it was done via proper procedures, that it went through the executive, that it was debated, and that there is proper documentation to support it. It is good that we know that it was $400,000 was spent, because in the past we know we've had many situations where we had to be begging and sending freedom of information requests and writing letters for months before we could even find out how much money was spent. So it is a refreshing change that we got the information early. But there are too many issues surrounding the event that have remained vague.
Well, when you say issues, what kind of issues you're talking about, Mr. Walker?
The issues, there's a whole host of issues here, but the key issue for me, more than anything else, is aligning what we've seen transpire here with what the electorate voted for in Tobago. I am very, very clear the electorate voted not just for generic change, just a broad concept of change. I am very clear that they voted for change in the way public funds are utilized and the way politicians report to us when we have questions about how our funds have been used. And in that regard, I am seeing two completely different approaches as between the two parties involved. Having heard from Watson Duke at the outset of the issue, with all kinds of accusations about people sleeping amongst dead rats and so on, we've heard nothing more, despite the fact that we're getting messages from people who were there, who basically are saying that it's not true. I would expect, in the interest of openness, that Mr. Duke would now elaborate and tell us what actually did happen. We also weren't aware at the beginning that the THA had actually either paid or committed $400,000. That had to come from the THA itself. You would expect that in a situation as grave as this, with him making the kinds of claims that he has made, that he would have told us that yes, the THA did contribute $400,000 and that he was in fact asking for more contribution, and that is where the problem arose. That was not the picture he painted. But going back to what I said about what the electorate voted for, I am very clear in my mind, having spoken with people before, during, and after the election, that the most important factor that people were voting for was an expectation that there would be greater attention to following proper procedures in the expenditure of public funds and proper reporting in the event that there were any questions asked. Now, from what we've heard, I can't hold my hand up and say that the request that has been made by Mr. Duke withstands any test of probity in the expenditure of public funds, because he essentially, and this is subject to him, clarifying because he hasn't said, but it seems that he simply picked up the phone, called Farley Augustine, said that these people need X amount of dollars and expected him to respond. That is not the way that any government should operate, and it certainly, I feel, is radically against what people voted for in Tobago. So on that score, that for me is the big issue. The other big issue is more of a political one, in that the actions of Mr. Duke seems to suggest that he believes that the fact that he is the leader of the PDP, the party in control of the THA, that gives him certain rights of access to the funds of the THA. He should be no different from any other individual in seeking funds from the THA, save and apart from in his role as the Deputy Chief Secretary. And even then, there is a process to be followed. So I don't.
But with that though, and we have 1 more minute on this side of the conversation, and I want to ask the question, Mr. Walker, do you think this is more of a knock against Mr. Duke in terms of like these actions and the fact that you can't hold your hands up and defend what was said, or is it a point or feather in Mr. Augustine, the Chief Sec's cap, saying, okay, well, it's not a matter of the party leader said this, so he as Chief Secretary just said, all right, Chief, all right, and allowed for that to happen?
I think it's a bit of both, but more importantly, the second of the two. It seems that we have a little problem with the lighting, but since we're going to be brief, I'll continue. I believe the electorate voted requiring Mr. Augustine to respond in their interest if there were any doubt about the expenditure of public funds, and I think he has done that.
And with that in mind, we take a short break, we fix the lighting, and we come back. We are speaking with financial analyst, Mr. David Walker. We are speaking about the distinction and the engagement of the THA and the PDP. Stay with us, we return with more. Welcome back. We are speaking with financial analyst David Walker. We are looking at the engagement between the PDP and THA and players involved. And Mr. Walker, looking at the question of what did Tobago vote for and that level of reporting, do you think can be reconciled? I mean, because people have taken positions, it seems as though lines have been drawn in the sand. But this is the first question to another one after. What's your take on that?
The lines that have been drawn in the sand, and I think you're right, clear lines have been drawn, are really nothing to do with the issue at hand. They're drawing lines about political interaction between the two key players, Mr. Duke and Mr. Augustine, which to my mind is not what this is about. Because that is, again, that is not what people voted for. People voted, essentially, they tasked Mr. Augustine to ensure that money was spent in accordance with rules and regulations, regardless of who asked for the money. And I feel that he was put in a position where he was left with no choice. He had to do what his electorate demanded of him. Failing to do that would be a betrayal of the electorate. Now, it is unfortunate that it comes at the price of having to, it seems, fall out with the most important member of his political group. But I don't think the electorate would have expected any different. I am convinced that that is what won the election, and that is what they expect from Mr. Augustine. Consider for a moment, had he done differently and sent that money out without proper procedures, what would have been the consequence for the whole party, not just Mr. Augustine, for the whole party in Tobago? They would have proven what the PNM had been alleging and what other people had been alleging, and that is they could not be trusted with the finances of the Tobago House of Assembly.
And in terms of looking at that, Mr. Walker, I think individuals, specifically in Trinidad, are looking at the situation, even from the results of the election, and there have been conversations about whether or not this motion, this kind of sweeping motion that we would have seen in the THA, whether or not it could happen in Trinidad with regard to the winds of change, okay, where we're looking for someone to come and provide an alternative that people can get behind and vote into office. There would be naysayers and people saying, you see, and to the point that you were just sharing, we can't trust them, it doesn't make sense, this is why we need to vote for this party. How do you think that impacts those kind of conversations, specifically in Trinidad, what we're looking at now?
Well, I think there's a powerful argument to be made in the PDP's favor as a result of this. But it's going to be up to them to make that point to the people in an effective way. The point is simply this. Let us look at the fact that they have been tested. So we don't need to wonder now how Mr. Augustine will react if somebody tries to cross the lines, to blur the distinction and do things that aren't within the proper procedures. We now know for sure, and I am certain if I were an advisor to him, I would be shouting that from the rooftop. We've been tested. We've done what we promised we would do. We have not allowed the misuse of public funds under my watch. So that would be my argument. And I think it's a powerful argument and it's a true argument. It's valid. He's been tested and he's proven himself.
And especially using that financial analyst hat, Mr. Walker, do you think there's anything that needs to be done policy-wise, tweaked, looking at this situation going forward, how it is finances are treated with? I know there was the conversation of whether or not the THA sent this group specifically, or whether or not it was something from Roxborough.
Yes, as I say, they've dealt with the situation, in my view, very well. Separate and apart from that, I have come to realize there are a lot of procedures that they've inherited, which ideally could do with revision in both directions. There are some procedures which are an impediment to them doing their work effectively. So what we like to call red tape. But there are also procedures which can be tightened up a bit more. So on both ends of the scale, I would strongly advocate for a thorough review of the financial processes within the Tobago House of Assembly. Bear in mind, there's an additional factor at play, which always comes to the fore when you have a change of regime, especially after a regime that's been in place for a long time. You have a lot of people who, sometimes for political reasons, sometimes simply because they're accustomed to doing things one way, place a drag on the incoming regime. It's not unique to Tobago, it happens the world over. And that presents challenges. It presents challenges to their ability to deliver in the kind of time frames that they hope that they would deliver, and in some cases where they promise they would deliver. And they have to be creative, but without breaking the rules. So yes, they have to review the procedure.
But to counter or to push back on that, Mr. Walker, a little bit, and would the people who are able to put that drag, that potential drag, would those gatekeepers, in the main, to my view, they would normally be public servants. But I think that there might be a little support for the incoming regime because of the fact that work has begun to regularize a lot of the contracts that are normally short term. So when people are saying, okay, well, yes, you're helping my money this way, let me do what I can, let me put my work in. How does that impact on this entire situation?
I think there's a huge amount of goodwill amongst the people in the public sector in Tobago. But it does not take very many to cause a contract, for example, a tender document. It doesn't take more than one or two people to cause something that should take 1 month to end up taking 3 months instead, with obvious consequences in the case of the schools reopening, for example. In those situations, sometimes a person like myself would actually advocate slightly breaking the rules, so that if something has to come through a certain individual and must be signed by that person before you could go ahead, sometimes you really have to ask yourself, is the greater good not served by bypassing the process in this case in order to have a school opened on time? And that kind of dilemma is being faced right across the sector. And it's usually just one individual, it doesn't take a whole lot of people because of the way the government processes are set up. This person has to sign and then move it to that person. And if that person is on leave, those have to be dealt with.
We dance around the conversation a little bit, but I think a lot has been shared. In the final minute, Mr. Walker, what are some of those things that you'd want us to come away from thinking about in this conversation?
So this whole saga has been most unfortunate. It needn't have happened. I will come out openly and say that it was started by Mr. Duke with that first video, and he's continued with 3 further videos. The flip side is that I am happy that an incident like this has occurred early on in their regime being in power. I give them time to sit back, assess, allow people to review the positions they've taken and find a way forward that is in the best interest of Tobago. But importantly, coming out of it, what I am most impressed with is the fact that Farley Augustine has stayed true to the promise that is made to the people of Tobago, that he will not spend public money without proper procedure and without being ready and willing to account for it.
And it says something when you are willing to be judged by history versus the immediacy of a situation. So we thank you for that, and thank you for making the time, Mr. Walker. And on behalf of the entire TTT News team, this has been In Depth with me, Dike. Thank you so much for joining us.